I'm here with author Dr. Jaques Margerison. He has developed a new approach to writing called Prosoems. Can you tell us more about this approach?
Prosoems is a combination of two words. One is called prose and the other one is called poems. And at school I wasn't very good at either. And one day I thought, why? Because I'm being forced into two directions. But suddenly it clicked. Maybe it'd be a great idea if we could actually combine the two. And therefore I developed a word which is called prose and oems. So prosoems. And what that means is that you can now actually write in any style that you want, whether it be with a rhyme or without a rhyme. And it's quite simple for people to understand. So I've developed this terminology which enables me to express myself in the way I want to. And I've also introduced it to school children. And they find it very easy now, rather than having to develop a particular literary style which is imposed upon them by the teacher. They can actually do it in poem or prose or a combination of both.
You mentioned that it's been used in schools. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I set up the opportunity at the schools where I previously went for the students to enter into a competition. And that really meant that they could come along with whatever they have written in either prose or poem or a combination of both and submit it. And instead of teachers judging, all of the fellow classmates had the opportunity to sit down and read other people's work and say which they liked the best. And of course that became quite innovative, and the teachers thought it was a great idea for the students to begin to assess each other's work. Very modern in terms of the modern way of thinking, particularly with students under the age of 10 who were able to sit down, not so much whether it was good English or bad English, but whether or not they liked it. And what we encourage them to do is write about things that they knew about, like going to the seaside or having a holiday or what they did at the weekend or playing in the street. So they could actually come with experiences which were familiar to them.
Fantastic. Can you give us an example of a prosoem?
Yes, in a book which I have written on innovators, I've done a number where I've taken the life story of particular individuals, and here I've got one of Marie Curie, who was a Polish person, and most people think that she was French. She actually lived most of her life in France, but actually her name Curie comes because she married a guy called Curie. And I've written the story of her life, combining some of the ideas which she worked on, her scientific work, and also done it in a style which combines prose and poems, but very much telling it through her eyes in terms of what she did during her life. Likewise, I've been to France and studied the history of the First and Second World War and tried to bring back stories which were real at the time, but were never told because the people never came back to tell them. But they really did have a story in terms of what they had actually done. And again, I tried to combine this with prose and poem. Sometimes I've invented characters. I've written a book called Imagine Land, which is for children. And in the stories, there are both poem elements where things rhyme and also the prose elements where they don't rhyme. But typically, prosoems are all based around one-line stories. So in effect, each line should be able to be a beginning and an end in its own right. So you go out and say, I was happy. That is a line. Next line tells you why. Because I had just been on my holidays. Next line would tell you what actually happened on the holiday. And so it builds up gradually until you get a story, not only about the situation, but about the people, what they did. But it's written line by line, rather than in the traditional mode where you have sentences and paragraphs. It becomes very easy to understand. So if I just flick to one in this particular book and sort of pick up an example of one of the great innovators, Alexander Graham Bell. I was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. We emigrated to Canada in 1870 to avoid TB, tuberculosis, that dreaded disease that killed my two brothers. I contracted it and it threatened my life. Upon my recovery, I decided to help others. The rhyme with brothers. But the beginning wasn't a rhyme, it was prose. I realised I had a talent for invention. I was particularly interested in sound. My wife was very deaf, therefore conversation was very difficult. And so the story unfolds almost as a series of sentences, but some rhyming and some not. So it provides the freedom for people to express themselves without feeling that they have in some way or other to conform with somebody else's rules and standards.
Fantastic. So how long have you been using this style of writing? You mentioned that you used it in school.
Yes, it was inspired by a French guy called Jaques Prevert, who I found something of his life about 10 years ago, and then visited France, where he did most of his work, and went to the home where he worked and looked at what he did. And he had this very simple, elegant, imaginative style of writing which brought people and characters to life. And I thought, well, that's fantastic. What we ought to do is provide a way in which other people can learn from that. And that's why I invented Prosoems. And gradually I began to realize the prosoem had a life of their own, because through the prosoem you could actually bring people back to life. You could actually interview them. So Galileo or Einstein, you could bring them back and in effect sort of say, well, how do you see not only your own life, but life in the year 2006, 2007, and in the process of which they can actually recount through my own record of what they had done in their life, through looking at their own biography, examples, illustrations, comment upon the way in which their ideas have been developed and innovation has taken place as a result of what they did.
Great. Thank you very much for your time, Charles.